Aloha! Welcome back to the Debrief from Hawaii News Now, where we break down the latest happenings in our local government and top issues in our community. I'm your host, Emily Cristobal, and in today's episode, we are taking a deeper dive into our discussion on housing. In January, Governor Josh Green put an emphasis on Hawaii's housing needs in his State of the State address, focusing on recovery in Lahaina.
Believe me when I say this, I'm going to put our people first, and I will be forced to declare a moratorium on all short-term rentals in West Maui until we find enough housing for the displaced families.
He even expanded on his plans to target short-term vacation rentals more broadly across the islands, saying they are artificially inflating the cost of housing and displacing residents. In the address, Green announced a new program, House Hawaii's Ohana, that would offer tax exemptions to a short-term vacation rental owner who sells their property to a local family or to someone who turns the home into a long-term rental for locals. He pledged to kick off the program this fall if the proposal is approved by the legislature. Meanwhile, the housing crisis has contributed to an alarming exodus of residents in recent years, which onlookers say is only forecast to worsen in the wake of the Lahaina disaster. To look more into the impact of short-term rentals on Hawaii's housing crisis, we are joined by Justin Tyndall of the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, otherwise known as UHERO. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to get right into it. First, speaking of the governor's State of the State address where he targeted vacation rentals, I was hoping you could take us back to what factors led to how this problem got to where it is today.
Right. So, the demand for vacation rentals in Hawaii is not a mystery, right? It's a beautiful state with a huge tourism economy. So, we naturally have a large international demand for visitors. And the, evolution of technology that allowed Airbnb and similar platforms to establish themselves was really well suited for the economy in Hawaii. So it really took off, obviously. So, where we are today, a huge share of Hawaii's housing stock is tied up in vacation rentals, about 4% statewide. And if we look, across counties, about 14% of Maui's housing is tied up in vacation rentals. So, it's having probably a pretty profound effect on the overall housing economy here, just by the sheer scale of the TVR market here in Hawaii.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking through some of your reports at UHERO about vacation rentals, and I found that of the states, around 565,000 units, 30,000 are listed as short-term vacation rentals. And if you think about that, that's such a portion, like 30,000, that could be 30,000 that could be going to locals and, residents and Native Hawaiians. Can you speak a little bit more about just the sheer impact that vacation rentals can have, whether it comes to prices or even just people trying to rent?
Sure. So, I think if we look at the national conversation, right, like cities like New York or LA, they have similar conversations about what's the impact of Airbnb on rents and home prices, right? And I think the main takeaway there is that there's some effect, but it's probably not a game changer in cities like that, right? So maybe in those cities we have 1 or 2% of their housing stock tied up in vacation rentals. But here it's a lot more, right? On Maui, for example, 14%, right? Just a huge share of our housing is in vacation rentals. So it's really, unthinkable that this isn't having some impact on the prices and rent in the state, making things less affordable. So, real thing we should be looking at is its impact on the supply of housing, right? So, another solution to low supply would be to build more housing, but we also don't do that. So, we need to look where we can to find more units to get into the long-term supply. And we have, as you say, at least 30,000 units currently as vacation rentals that otherwise, many of them could be in the long-term supply, and that would have a meaningful impact on the supply of housing for locals. Yeah.
Yeah, you kept mentioning that for Maui, it's 14%. I think that kind of leads us to one of the graphs that I found in that housing fact book that you guys came up with. The two top ones that I was really surprised about was Kauai and Maui County. And obviously some of this data has changed because of what happened on Maui with the wildfires. But can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in these graphs?
Right. So just, Maui and Kauai in particular are just way, out of proportion to any other market in the U.S. in terms of the impact of vacation rentals. Just an enormous amount of housing is tied up in vacation rentals. I was looking at recent updates to this data, since the fires. So, in the fires in Maui, we saw a pretty sharp drop-off in listings, right after the fires because of, tourism and legal barriers to having vacation rentals. But in the last few months, it's rebounded almost entirely. So it seems like we've lost about 300 vacation rentals, directly in the fire-affected areas. But there's really been no drop in other places in Maui, right? So the total amount of vacation rentals in Maui has really recovered almost entirely, which is, pretty interesting and, feeds into these conversations on the role of vacation rentals in remedying, solutions for fire survivors, right? We still have a huge supply of vacation rentals on Maui that could be used for long-term rentals potentially.
I also wanted to bring up another statistic that the governor brought up during his speech. He said that 52% of all short-term rentals in Hawaii are owned by non-state residents, and 27% of short-term rental owners own 20 or more units. Can you talk about the economic impact of that and kind of just break down those numbers for people to understand why those numbers are concerning?
Yeah, so we were digging into this information. This was actually a little bit new information to me, right? So, we don't have perfect data on who's running vacation rentals. So my understanding of those numbers is from property tax information and the actual permit information, as you can get people's home addresses and come up with these figures. But this evidence does suggest that a very large proportion of vacation rentals are owned by people out of state and sort of institutional almost investors that are operating many, many of these units, right? So, one drawback of regulating or taxing vacation rentals is we can think up stories of, an individual whose income is, a local individual, their income is reliant on running a vacation rental. And those people exist, but it seems like it's actually a very small share of the market, right? The sort of median vacation owner that you would, in reality should envision, right, is probably someone from out of state operating many vacation rentals. So when we're designing policies, we might want to differentiate the treatment between those two types of investors. But, the typical person operating a TVR, is not, Auntie renting out her bedroom, right? It's a person from out of state, operating, buying up condos and renting them out on Airbnb.
Yeah, absolutely. Through your extensive research into housing in Hawaii, if the state were to eliminate short-term rentals, would there be enough housing for locals and Native Hawaiians? And how would this impact, the cost of the home and rent and all of that?
Yeah, so I think, a couple things are true. One is that, this is not the only barrier to affordability in Hawaii, right? And probably it's not even the top reason that housing is expensive here, right? So you heard this report trying to use evidence from other cities that have been able to study the impact of Airbnb on rents and housing prices, right? Our best guess for Oahu is if we got rid of vacation rentals entirely, rents and prices would drop by about 5%, right? So even if we achieve that, Oahu would still have among the highest housing prices in the country, right? Which wouldn't solve the housing crisis, but 5% is pretty meaningful to people, struggling to get by. But this is for Oahu. So the issue with estimating this on Kauai and Maui is there's just really no other place, in the U.S. or, hardly anywhere that has this level of vacation rentals. So we would expect, eliminating or heavily regulating TVRs would have an even larger price effect in these areas. But I think we don't really know exactly how much it would be. So I think it's safe to say it would be meaningful, but the extent we're not exactly sure. And again, there's other barriers, particularly supply barriers. So if we allowed more housing to be built in general, we wouldn't really have to pick and choose between land uses, right? We could, have vacation rentals, and we could also house people, right? We just would need to build more housing. But, in a world where we're not doing that, we have to make decisions about, how we want to allocate scarce housing. So, allocating more vacation rentals to long-term rentals would undoubtedly have some effect on affordability for locals.
Absolutely. I kind of wanted to talk about how you said that short-term rentals, obviously that is one barrier, but it may not be the biggest barrier. And you did mention supply. Looking at Hawaii and housing, what do you think the supply would have to be in order to, house everybody?
Yeah, so this is such an important question. And, the state, for example, has commissioned a lot of studies to try to get at this number, right? This is the number people want to get. I guess as an economist, I have trouble thinking about whether this is the right way to ask the question, right? So the amount of people we have in Hawaii is going to be a function of how expensive housing is, right? So if we make housing cheaper, people who left to go to California or Nevada are going to come back, right? So I think there's really no number. The more housing we built, the cheaper housing is going to be, right? And that's going to benefit residents, right? But it's also potentially going to add to population. And some of these are going to be returning residents, some of these are going to be new residents, but it's really like a sliding scale, right? The more supply we add in terms of housing, the more affordability we'll have. But I think looking for a magic number, politicians and policymakers like to have goals, right? So, people throw out 40, 50, 60,000 new units, that would be fantastic, right? That would make things more affordable. I don't know that, we can pin down the exact number, though, because it's going to be a spectrum of affordability depending on how much we build.
Yeah, thank you for, trying to tackle that question. I totally see what you mean when, as much numbers you can plug in, you still have to account for, the potential of people coming back home and all of that. So I can totally see how that number, while it may be hard to pinpoint, there's like that ratio of, you said maybe 40,000 to 60,000. More housing seems to just be the answer. Going back to vacation rentals, the governor also announced his House Hawaii's Ohana plan, in which he hopes to offer tax exemptions to any out-of-state homeowner who sells the property to a local family or turns it into a long-term rental for locals. How could something like this benefit Hawaii residents?
Right. So this was maybe the more innovative approach that was suggested in the State of the State for addressing the opportunity to shift short-term rentals into the long-term market. I think with any of these type of proposals, the devil's in the details as to how effective it would be. So providing incentives for people to switch into the long-term market is generally a good idea. But we would worry, I think, as economists, we'd worry about other spillovers, right? So we could think of someone who was already planning to sell their unit, right? And then they hear about this program and they think, oh, great, I can get a huge tax windfall, right, by filing under this program. The extent to which it's going to actually convince more people to switch their properties into the long-term market, I think is unclear. I would throw out that, a more direct way to target this issue would be to increase property taxes on vacation rentals. So, on Maui and elsewhere, we already charge differential property taxes based on owner-occupier or short-term rentals, right? So if we just, significantly increased property taxes on short-term rentals, this would provide the incentives for people to get out of that market and get into, make it available to an owner-occupier who would pay very low rates, or a renter who would, pay lower property tax rates. So I think that seems to me to be the more direct policy solution. But I'm interested in hearing more details about this proposal in the State of the State. That it has potential to also be impactful.
Governor Green said on average, short-term rental properties can make 4 times what they would if the property was simply rented to a local family. As an economist, what do you think the likelihood is of owners actually following through with the plan that the governor proposed if they make that much money? Is the tax exemption enough to convince these owners to sell?
Right. Probably not for the typical owner who is running a vacation rental, right? So, if it's true, the typical income they take is 4 times as much, we're going to need a pretty, seismic shift to convince people to shift into the long-term market, right? Again, I throw out property taxes, right? We can pick the rate we want, right? So if we want to really discourage people from running short-term rentals and move them into the long-term market, we sort of already have the policy lever available, right? We could just make them pay more into, public coffers through property taxes, and this would discourage the use of those properties as short-term rentals.
Yeah, as someone who looks at the numbers a lot, what do you think would that sweet spot be for that property tax number?
That's probably I don't have that answer off the top of my head,
Yeah.
But a lot more. So I think on Maui, it's not a huge difference between depending on use, right? So again, if you're making quadruple what you do in the long-term rental market, right? This could be $7,000 additional dollars a month, right? So right now that's getting transferred from vacationers to the owners of those properties. So what's the right split for that $7,000 between the government and that property owner, right? Right now the government is taking a tiny fraction of that. They could take a lot more. So I think that might be the framework to look at. This is huge surplus that these property owners are getting. What's the fair number that the government should take, right? And what's the optimal number in terms of shifting people into the long-term market?
Yeah, absolutely. And, talking about short-term rentals, I was wondering if you had any other data that you wanted to share about your research into this, and maybe even any issues that you can compare to what we're seeing in the continent.
Right. So, I think, again, it's very hard to use, because Hawaii is so unique, it's very hard to use lessons from other places, right? That's true for many things, and it's true for vacation rentals, right? So, we just have this enormous quantity of vacation rentals in Hawaii that's quite unique. The concentration of vacation rentals is, pretty staggering. Like on Oahu, there's been some success, right? We've seen in the data a drop in vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods and somewhat of an increase in like Waikiki and other resort areas, right? But the impact that having a neighborhood that's 60% vacation rentals, right? Anyone who's suggesting that this is like not having a significant impact on the neighborhood, I think isn't really paying attention, right? There's certain neighborhoods in Hawaii that the majority of housing is vacation rentals, right? So that's pretty interesting in terms of the effect that's having on communities and those neighborhoods. So that's sort of a uniquely Hawaii issue that we need to think about these long-term impacts on what kind of neighborhoods we want to have.
Yeah, and you mentioned neighborhoods. Can you kind of put out some of the neighborhoods that you're really seeing these more short-term rentals in these areas? Where are we seeing that?
Yeah, so I mean, in this fact book report we have, right? So we, on Oahu, we were looking at, Waikiki is just incredibly concentrated with vacation rentals. Turtle Bay and other vacation areas, right? But on Maui, what we talked quite a bit about was the concentration on West Maui, right? So like I was saying, this concentration of vacation rentals, plummeted for about 2 months in September and October, but has really almost completely recovered, with the exception of the units that were actually destroyed, right? So, in terms of Maui fire recovery, one of the biggest wells of vacation rentals, right, is on West Maui, right? So, this was before the fire, identified as an area that was like really concentrated with vacation rentals, I don't want to say anything's fortunate in this situation, but this is the same area that there's a lot of displaced people in need of that housing. So there's an alignment between the need and the location of vacation rentals in West Maui.
Now, that was just the first part of our conversation with UHERO's Justin Tyndall. Make sure to tune in to the next episode of The Debrief, where we'll get more into the numbers of how housing prices have soared over the years and what Justin says needs to happen to cool down the cost. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and mahalo for listening.